Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone can hear me and see me okay. You're all very welcome to our Walk My Shoes parent webinar, focusing on coping strategies and anxiety. My name is Amanda and I'm project manager for Walk My Shoes, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. So for anyone that isn't familiar with Walk My Shoes, it is a mental health awareness and education campaign of St. Patrick's Mental Health Services. And we decided to do this webinar for parents because, well, we all know parents play a massive role in guiding and sustaining our children's mental health, especially during difficult times like now with the coronavirus outbreak. So we wanted to present a webinar designed to support you, the parents, in sustaining your children's emotional well-being. So that is the idea behind today's webinar. So I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. First off, we have Paul Gilligan, who is the Chief Executive Officer of St. Patrick's Mental Health Services. And Paul will present on how parents can help their children to develop different coping strategies. And our second presenter for the day will be Dr. Colman Noctor, who is a child and adolescent psychotherapist in St. Patrick's Mental Health Services. And Colman will be speaking about how parents can help their children to deal with anxiety and how to better manage it. So before we get started, I just have a couple of things that I'd like to mention. So during today's webinar, we would love to hear from you. So if you have any questions at all, you can just pop them into the Q&A box, which you should see on the right-hand side of your screen, or at least a little Q&A tab that you can click on. You can put in your question in there and it'll come to us, and we'll try our absolute best to answer as many questions as we can throughout the webinar. Now, I know a few parents had sent questions in advance through our email, which we have stored, so that's absolutely fine. We can ask the questions there to our speakers, and again, we will try our absolute best to answer as many as possible. And if you are tweeting during the event today, please don't forget to tag us. You can tag us at Walk in My Shoes, or you can use the hashtag WIMS webinar, so WIMS webinar. I think we can go ahead and get started. Paul, if you'd like to turn on your mic, you can start your presentation.
Thanks, thanks, Amanda. So I'm hoping everybody, first of all, can hear me and can see me. I'm delighted to be asked to do this. I have been asked today to talk about coping strategies, but before I do that, and while I get the opportunity to share my slides, I'd like everybody who's on this webinar to, first of all, get a page and get a pencil, and to start off by doing a very brief exercise, maybe take 30 seconds to a minute, just to consider a difficult emotional time you experienced as a child or teenager, and how you coped with this and how your parents coped with it. So just maybe take 30 seconds while I'm putting up the slides to think about that exercise. So I'm going to leave that there for the moment and come back to it, but I suppose just to start off by saying I am a parent myself, although my children are 30 and 27, so they would argue that I know absolutely nothing about modern day parenting. On top of that, like many others, I've never been through a pandemic, and so the new challenges that are being presented by the times we're living in, again, I'm not so sure that I'm qualified to really talk about that. So what I've really done today is try to focus on the key aspects of parenting and how parents can enhance their own mental health and indeed their child's mental health. And I suppose, first of all, just to start off with a quotation from Alice Miller, because I think we should keep in the back of our minds right the way through this presentation, and indeed right the way through difficult times, that really our own childhoods and how we brokered and came through those childhoods are really key to how we parent our own children. And I think it's always useful to just reference that, to be able to link in with the good and the bad of that, and to draw off the sort of things that we experienced as children and the sort of things our parents did. Emotions are what make us human. Protecting and enhancing emotional well-being and mental health is the responsibility of humanity. Why am I saying that? Because very often we forget that, in fact, emotions are what distinguishes us from other forms of life. And therefore, it's really important that not just as parents, but indeed right the way through society, that we focus on this key aspect of being human. When we talk about coping from a parenting perspective, we're talking about protecting and enhancing our child's mental health and protecting and enhancing our own mental health. And this particular slide outlines what we mean when we talk about a child's well-being. It's one that's developed by the ombudsman from across Europe. And it's a very, very interesting one because for me, it really highlights the holistic nature of mental health, how really it permeates through all of our child's development, ranging from our child's ability to just participate, but also to learn, to contribute, their unique personality, their freedom, their ability to be able to play, being loved and feeling secure. All of those components make up our mental health. Protecting and enhancing children's mental health is not only a key component of promoting their rights and including their best interests, but also has immense advantages. It really does not just enhance our child's world, our child's life, but indeed enhances our life as parents, and indeed the communities in which we live in and society in general. Interestingly, when we look at parent mental health, it involves pretty much the same components. Some of them that I've highlighted in red on this slide are really worth highlighting because sometimes as parents we forget, and sometimes as adults we forget, that part of what we're trying to do is continue to grow. The idea of play for parents is an interesting one, but I mean, you know, to be able to relax and enjoy ourselves is essential to being a parent. It's essential to being a grown-up. So pretty much parent and child mental health are similar. The challenges are the same, the components are the same. Protecting and enhancing emotional well-being essentially involves 4 key things. Reminding ourselves that we are loved and are lovable, believing in ourselves and our abilities, what I term self-belief, and knowing how to be happy, contentment, and feeling safe. I'm always wary about this particular slide because I used to do a lot of presentations in school halls, and leaving one at one stage to people I heard in the lobby, excuse me, talking about the presentation. One said he talked about throwing stuff in a bucket. The other person said he seemed to say he didn't care about emotional health. So this is the emotional bucket, and within that bucket is those 4 components. What is our role as parents? Our role as parents involves focusing on 4 core things. Helping our child believe that he/she is loved and is lovable, that he/she is a good person, helping them to learn how to be happy, and helping them to feel safe. The most effective parenting involves helping our child to get to know their emotional selves, develop the ability to recognize and deal with their own emotions, learn to shape their thinking and behavior, and really to help them get in touch with their individualism. As I want to come back now to the start of the presentation, I'm fascinated with parenting today because for me, not being a parent of children, I think parenting is really under siege. Parents themselves report lacking confidence to deal with mental health issues. Research conducted in the last couple of years by the National Parents Council said that 88% of parents felt that they needed extra training when it came to working with their children around mental health. There's no doubt that media discussion regarding children and particularly teenagers is at times overwhelmingly negative. Stigma around those with mental health difficulties, while it's moving forward, and I'll talk a little bit about our recently launched campaign in a couple of minutes, but the recent research conducted indicates that 73% of people would now tell their partner if their child was being treated for a mental health difficulty. And that demonstrates a 7 to 10% increase in the numbers from, say, 3 to 4 years ago. But unfortunately, we've seen a 9% drop in those that believe that people in mental health services can fully recover and lead normal lives. And then lastly, of course, we know that getting help for a child is really difficult. Any type of help, there's lots of waiting lists. It's very hard to access services, and this is a real challenge for parents. So waiting lists for mental health service in particular are too long. And so it's fair to say that at many levels in society, we are failing our children, and the obligation and the pressure is really immense on parents to try and cope themselves and deal with what's viewed as maybe many new challenges that perhaps parenting in the past hadn't to contend with. So I want to really throw out probably what's key to my presentation today, which is this concept of finding our inner parent. Key to protecting and enhancing our child's wellness and our own wellness is focusing on finding our inner parent and empowering our child. Meeting the emotional needs of our children, our teenagers and young people is best done by connecting with our inner love for our child and focusing on the core components of child-centered parenting. And what are they? Well, they're an adherence to the idea that children have rights and that they're key principles of parenting, and they're already articulated in various different ways throughout society. But it's translating these concepts into everyday parenting, and that is really key. I'm going to stop there for a second, and I'm going to ask you to go back to your piece of paper. What I want you to do is write on the piece of paper 2 positive memories that you have of your childhood. And on another 2 pieces of paper, I want you to write down 2 negative memories you have of your childhood. I want you to just take 30 seconds to do that. So 2 positive memories you have of your childhood, and then 2 negative memories you have of your childhood. So while I'm talking, I'd be very happy for you to continue to maybe think about that. And what I'm really trying to do is get you to balance 2 things today. Thinking about the parenting of your children, but also getting back in touch with some of the things and experiences you had as a child yourself. I think once you start to focus on that, it's really easy. And it's amazing how, no matter how old you are, you're able to link in with stuff that happened in your childhood, positive and negative. So child-centered parenting, in many ways, this is very simple, and yet it's made complex by the responsibilities, maybe the confusions, the complexities of modern day parenting, and indeed the confusions and complexities we now have around mental health. In essence, child-centered parenting involves making sure we bring a positive set of beliefs to our parenting of every child, focusing on empowering, enhancing, and building the personal psychological capabilities of our child, ensuring as best we can that the child is in an acceptably safe, nurturing environment, and making sure that we look after our own psychological health. These principles are particularly important when parenting children with mental health difficulties, or if we're experiencing mental health difficulties ourselves. So connecting with this inner love we have for our child is essential, our inner parent. And you know, I've worked before St Patrick's Mental Health Services. I worked for ISPCC, and I worked with many children who are now adults who had, in what objective terms would be horrendous childhoods, and yet they have become very conscientious, loving parents themselves, because they've seen and understood the real importance of giving their children an experience they didn't have. And really, when you talk to them, it's very interesting, because what you find is they find this inner strength. They haven't experienced many of the positive parenting aspects that other people have, and yet they believe sincerely that they have this inner parent that will help them and guide them do the right thing for their children. But the inner parent that we all have, I believe, involves loving our child unconditionally. That is really interesting. Always fascinating to watch parents and with new babies, with small children, and how the love for their children is so obvious. Sometimes it's more difficult as children get older in teenage years, and yet you always, when you look and see the sort of bond parents have, even with teenagers who are giving them grief and all the rest of it, that unconditional love is really key. Valuing the uniqueness of our child, again, often difficult and challenging. Do we compare? Of course we compare. How difficult is it not to compare? Do we want to know how other people did in exams? Do we want to know how other people did on the football field or at the dance class? Of course we do. But valuing the uniqueness of our child and believing in our natural parenting ability. Having a positive set of beliefs requires substantial work. It involves commitment. And it really requires us to be willing to assess and challenge and be honest with ourselves. And that isn't about beating ourselves up, but it's about challenging our negative views of our children. It's about challenging whether we were parented with negative parenting styles and whether we can overcome that. Tapping in if we were parented in a positive way. Being able to accept and reflect on how our own childhoods, our parents, our school experiences, our experiences of parenting. So if we've more than one child, what have we done with the first child or the second child? Our work lives, the communities and societies in which we live has and is impacting on our beliefs. That's really imperative. So our beliefs around children are going to be shaped by all of these things. And I challenge you to be able to ignore all of the stuff that flies around the media, for example, around children. Most recently, you know, children are being tarred with the brush of they're the only ones who are breaking all of the COVID restrictions. And of course, we know adults are doing it all the time as well. And yet the main focus is on this idea that in some way children are the ones who need to be corralled, again, putting pressure on parents. Being able to acknowledge that our relationship with each of our individual children is different and special is vital. Time and time again, the research demonstrates that the factor producing the most healthy children is the relationship they have with their parents. So when I talk about empowerment, empowering children, what do I mean? I've pulled together this slide just to really help, I suppose, outline the key components that I believe consist of empowering children. The first one is ego. Certainly, and I sound now like the grandfather, or I'm going to say now what does my children's head in, which is in my day. But in my day, you didn't really have ego. You were always taught to know your place, never be too confident. And yet we now know that building a child's confidence is really important. They need to have an ego. They need to believe in themselves. The second component is this idea of meaning. It's really important that children have meaning in their lives. And of course, that depends very much on parents appreciating the importance of meaning and also looking at their own meaning in their own lives. At times that can be difficult, particularly in a changing society like the one we have in Ireland at the moment. Many of us in the past would have taken our meaning from spiritual, religious aspects of our lives. What is meaning? What gives a child meaning? What gives us our meaning in our lives? Personal autonomy. Feeling that you have control of your life, and I suppose also that you're able to make decisions for yourself. And again, that's also very important in terms of children, based on developmental age, based on their capabilities. And that's comes back to this individualism that's around the parent-child relationship. A parent knows best how much capabilities their child has, what their child is able for and what they're not able for. Ownership. It's very interesting when you talk about rights and children and parents, you very quickly draw people into this conversation about responsibilities. And I think responsibilities is an interesting word, but I think ownership is perhaps a better word. So helping young people, children, to have ownership for their decisions, for what they say, for what they do. And that is, again, a part of growing up, a part of learning. You can't hold a 2-year-old responsible. You can hold a 13-year-old more responsible, and you can certainly hold a 17-year-old responsible. Ownership and responsibility are key to building a person's self-esteem and self-worth, and particularly where children are concerned, that is particularly so. Welfare, the simple things, making sure that they're looked after, making sure that they look after themselves. Really important in terms of empowerment. If a child is under pressure in regards to their welfare, all of those other things become somewhat irrelevant. Energy. Sometimes we forget about this. Often I think, and particularly when we are challenged by things like a pandemic, it's easy to withdraw into a situation where we lack energy. Sometimes that becomes even close to depression. And it's really important that we build for our child a sense of enthusiasm. And that can be difficult as parents and adults because we believe and see the world for what it is. We get concerned about all the risks. We sometimes are worried about letting our children take risks. Giving them that space to have energy and enthusiasm is key. And lastly, this concept of recovery. This idea that, young people will experience challenges. They will experience mental health difficulties. We can't prevent that from happening necessarily. We don't want it to happen for the wrong reasons, but very often we can't determine what's going to influence our child's mental health. Giving them the capacity to recover from that is really vital. Helping them understand and know what their mental health is when they're running into difficulties, and the skills involved in recovery is really key. Ensuring our understanding and beliefs about mental health are healthy is also really important. Research by the Royal College of Surgeons about 5 to 10 years ago indicates that 1 in 3 children aged 13 or under will experience mental health issues, while this number increases to 1 in 2 by the age of 25. Worldwide, the research indicates that 1 in 10 children experience a mental health difficulty severe enough to require specialist support. Aside from children with ADHD and those related difficulties, the highest number presenting to services are those with anxiety and depressive difficulties. The research is pretty clear that mental health difficulties are caused by a combination of personality, experiences, existing supports and emotional resilience. Yet still we have a major misunderstanding around and a debate around, I suppose, what causes, what impacts on people with the most serious mental health difficulties. We still have sections of society that believe that people who experience such serious difficulties are different. They cannot recover. That many mental health problems are actually social problems, family problems, that they're the responsibility of families or individuals to address themselves. Many feel still that those with mental health difficulties just need to pull themselves together, and that other health conditions are more worthy of treatment than those with mental health, than mental health is. We still engage in outdated debates about medication versus talk therapies. In effect, what all this does is it creates stigma. And deep down, really, stigma is created by a couple of personal things, one of which is this idea of fear. For many of us, coping with mental health problems and the distress and hopelessness caused by those problems, it requires us in some way psychologically to deny their existence, to bury them in our subconscious, and to avoid confronting our emotional and psychological selves. To protect ourselves, we tend to reject the notion of mental health problems, and then we find it very difficult to accept those who declare that they experience such problems. A lack of understanding and knowledge about the true nature of mental health, the problems that can arise, and how to help a person recover really exacerbate these reactions. Why is emotional health so important to children? Why is empowerment so important to children? But being emotionally healthy enables a child to tell the truth about their lives and themselves. It helps them to live passionately and to the full. It facilitates their greater understanding of the human condition, and it enables them to recognize their strengths and weaknesses and make the most of both. And it involves a child finding meaning in their lives. Let's come back to that time and time again. How do we deal with specific mental health issues? And I'm not going to get into this too much today, and I know Colman, who works in this area, has a good lot to say on this, but specific mental health difficulties are best addressed within a recovery model, the core principles which are self-directed care, a holistic approach, and maintaining hope. Again, all reinforced by this parenting model that we're talking about today. Dealing with acute declarations or episode of mental health crisis involves staying calm, speaking openly about the difficulties, agreeing a strategy to manage things, providing support or seeking specialised help when it's appropriate, maintaining stamina throughout the journey of recovery, and seeking support for ourselves as parents or carers. So I'm going to stop there again, and this time what I want you to do is, and I'm hoping that people are finding this useful, is you should have 4 memories in front of you, wherever you're joining us from. I'd like you to take 1 memory and put it in your pocket for safekeeping. I'd like you to take 2 of the memories you have, whether they be positive or negative, and I'd like you to roll them up and throw them into the bin or get rid of them somewhere. And lastly, what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to take 1 last memory, and I'm going to ask you to, after this webinar is over, talk to somebody about it. Just casually, anybody you trust, remembering that what happened in your childhood that made you feel good or bad, and how you feel that's impacted on you today. Empowerment is really key in terms of mental health and giving our child an opportunity to live a mentally healthy life. And I'm hoping that, yes, I hope that slide now is visible to you. And that's what happens when we empower our child. Effectively, they fly. Moving to the impact of COVID-19, and so we, St. Patrick's Mental Health Services conducted research in June that indicated that over 50% of parents were concerned about the impact of COVID-19 on their children's mental health. In particular, they were concerned about the lockdown and the impact of the various restrictions. They quite rightly identified that the social isolation, the risks of social isolation for their children were significant, not just from school, but indeed just being able to meet up with friends, etc. And here's a very simple guide, and again, I know, and I'm not going to dwell on this because I know Colman's going to deal with it later on, but how do we cope with the impact of COVID-19? And we don't know, because we've never been here before. Even in terms of our own mental health, and in terms of our work life, and in terms of our social life as adults, we're still trying to grapple with what exactly are the implications. But I think we go back to the core of good parenting, and the core of how we deal with challenges that have arisen, and what is the good model of doing that. And the first one is staying calm, and making sure we and our child understand what is happening. I think a lot of people fall at this first hurdle. I think certainly I can see myself how easy it is to fall into a zone of fear, a zone of extensive anxiety when it comes to COVID-19. It's so easy to get sucked into a continuous litany of news stories, a continuous litany of bad news. So it's about getting an understanding, an accurate understanding, and then transferring that to our child. Talking with our child, talking with others, but also containing that so that it doesn't dominate everything. Reassuring ourselves and reassuring our child, and that can be quite difficult during these difficult times when there's so much uncertainty. Building and keeping routines, but allowing ourselves also the opportunity to unwind and allowing our child to unwind. Many parents find it very difficult to see their child doing nothing, and yet that's a key part of childhood. It's a key part of being a teenager. Allowing them relax is really important, and taking care of ourselves and taking care of our child, vital at this time. Giving ourselves a break from the COVID-19 discussions, a break from worrying, a break from routine, a break from work, a break from even parenting where that's appropriate, and informing ourselves and being honest, really important. Children and young people know when we're not being honest, so it's really important that we, in an age-appropriate way, help them understand what's happening, give them the facts, and try and contain our sense of worry or anxiety, but also be honest with them. Essential to parenting and essential to ensuring our child is emotionally healthy is ensuring that we protect our own emotional health. Parenting is one of the most emotionally satisfying things we can do, but it's also one of the most difficult. Alongside substantial stress and risk, there can be a lack of positive feedback or perceived results. Relationships, work, health pressures all add to this. Think of the last time that somebody said, "Well done, you're a great parent." Think of the last time your child or a young person said, "You're a great parent." But then step back a little bit from that and think, well, hold on, Think of all the positive feedback you do actually receive as a parent that isn't as overt as a straightforward statement. Whether you get that or not, it's really important that you give it to yourself, because parenting is such a vital part of society. Protecting our personal emotional well-being is usually best achieved by developing a personal emotional health enhancement plan. And I'm conscious, as many of you are, of how much people are focused on physical health. We see people taking it very seriously. They have new physical health, physical exercise plans. We need the same for our mental health, for our emotional health. Developing an emotional health toolbox, which contains daily emotional health plans, a mechanism to recognize triggers and early signs of distress, an action plan that we're going to put in place if we run into serious difficulties, all really important. So before I finish my last exercise, I want to ask you to do one more thing, and that is, I want you to identify on that piece of paper that you have in front of you, one emotional tool or skill you have, one thing you do on a daily basis to enhance your emotional health, one thing you do to recognize triggers, and one thing you do when you're feeling stressed or down. We'll take 30 seconds to do that. So while you're doing that, I'm going to just summarise. From a moral, societal and legislative perspective, there's a requirement to give all children, teenagers, the opportunity to live a safe, happy and healthy life. That's a societal obligation. It's defined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's defined in the Irish Constitution. And there's now raft of legislation in place to try and help us achieve those societal obligations. But inevitably, the focus falls back on parents. Inevitably, parents carry the burden of trying to look after, enhance and protect their child's mental health. Because children grow up, we think a child's purpose is to grow up, but a child's purpose is to be a child. Life's bounty's in its flow, later is often too late. Parenting should be rewarding. It's certainly draining and it's certainly challenging, and its impact can be hard to see. The goals we set ourselves are crucial. We can't really change our family, we cannot change our children, they change themselves. The best we can do is take a human rights empowering approach, seeing our child as the centre of our parenting and empowering our child. The goals for each of our children, the goals we set, need to be set by them themselves. We need to find ways to measure our success based on how well our child meets the goals they have set for themselves. And lastly, again, just to reinforce, parenting is essential work. It helps shape and change children's lives in ways we never really appreciate. This is so important to remember. It's so important to celebrate. I'd like to thank you very much for joining today. I know Colman is coming up next, and I really appreciate your time. I'm going to finish up now, but I'm going to leave you with a small piece of video that was developed by Bernardo's UK, and I think it really captures the concept of child-centred parenting and empowering children.
Freedom and of pleasure.
Thanks a million, Paul. That was brilliant. I think there's some great advice in there for parents in relation to developing coping strategies for their children. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. We've had loads of questions in, so as I said, we will try our best to get to as many as possible. But I'll just go ahead, Paul, and start calling them out to you if that's okay. So the first one from an attendee is, what is the best way to prepare a 7-year-old for returning to the classroom and the new normal? So should you be preparing them for this new normal?
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. I think that's a really good question. I think the person who asked the question probably already knows the answer to that. Parents spend most of August, in truth, psychologically preparing children to go back to school in September. We all know that. It's part of normal parenting. This is a little different, but I think children will be remarkably resilient. They will adapt very fast to the new normal, but it is really vital that those conversations are being had. And conversations like this are, I'm a great believer in what I term integrated parenting. The idea of sitting around and having the big chat around the kitchen table is never a good idea. It's the conversation when you're washing the dishes or filling the dishwasher. It's the conversation when you're putting away the toys. It's the conversation when you're in the car. They're the vital conversations. And those conversations need to be had. What do you think it's going to be like when you go back to school? Are you looking forward to it? Are you looking forward to seeing Johnny or Mary? And it might not be the exact same way as it was before. All of those are really important. The more preparation we can do, without also ruining August for yourself or your child, because who necessarily wants to spend all of August talking about September. But I think without doing that, I think prep is really important, and it's done in that normal conversational manner that keeps everybody nice and secure, and also keeps people feeling actually this is not that much different. It's just going to be changed from what it was last year.
Brilliant, thanks a million, Paul. And just kind of staying on the topic of our new normal, a parent wanted to know, just in relation to working from home, how do we prepare children for when parents go back? So if we're getting the children ready to go back to school and their new normal, what can parents do to prepare children for the parents going back to their new normal if they return to the office, if that's the case?
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a tougher one, because it's been really interesting talking to parents, and I think the initial impact was, how am I going to balance work with parenting? I think what happened next, and I know Colman's going to talk about this, was many parents and children became really comfortable and started to enjoy the new normal, and that is gonna change. I would say to parents, you've got to take an individual approach to this. If you feel that this has benefited your parenting and you've enjoyed it and it's benefited your children, you're negotiating with your employer. If you feel that this is not for you or for your child, then you're really again in that conversation around what's going to happen in a few weeks' time when you're back to work. I think one of the things I would say is, I think children are remarkably resilient. I think children are able for an awful lot more change than we give them credit for, but it's all about preparation, conversation and honesty, and I think that's where I would start. But I do think one of the great things about this this time, coming out of a horrendous time for people in one way, has been the opportunity it raises for us to change our work practices, to change the way we do things. We are definitely spending more time with family. That can be really positive. We need to try and capitalise on that, and I think see what's best for us and negotiate around that. But conversation is really important, prep is really important, and keeping things in perspective.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. I'm just really conscious of time, so I just have 2 quick questions for you, if that's okay. An attendee was wondering if you would say a main reason for anxiety in children is a lack of feeling insecure, or how do we make our children feel a sense of security?
Yeah, I wouldn't agree with that. I think that's, and I think it's a really good statement, because I think a lot of people feel that. A lot of parents beat themselves up because they associate anxiety with insecurity, and they say, you know, I must have done something wrong. I've failed my child, because they're really anxious. They find it difficult to do all the things that other kids seem to be able to do. Anxiety isn't necessarily about insecurity. Anxiety is about other things. It's about stress and worry, and about risk taking, and it's about all of the stuff that comes on top of an experience a person has. It can come as a result of a bad experience. It can come, coming back to the 4 key factors. It can be a kid can simply be prone to anxiety. So I think I would move away from this idea that in some way the child is insecure, and move more towards you know, what can be done to build up their sense of confidence, their way of managing anxiety, their understanding of their anxiety. And I also think it's really important for parents not to. One of the biggest mistakes parents make, and I can say this probably, and Colman will disagree with me, and all of the people attending today can criticize me, is again this lack of confidence, this insecurity, this beating yourself up that you're not doing enough. Research tells us that parents are doing more for their children than ever before. They're spending more time with their children than ever before, more quality time, and they're taking parenting much more serious than previous generations did, because previous generations had other things on their mind: poverty, security of housing, etc. Now, I'm not. There's a lot of people challenged with housing in Ireland at the moment, but the point being that parenting as a concept is being taken much more seriously. People are thinking much more carefully about having children, etc. So within that context, I think it's easy for parents to fall into that beat yourself up mindset. It's really important you challenge that within yourselves.
Thanks, Paul. The last question then I have it's in relation to the coronavirus again, and I suppose about explaining the news to children. And I know you touched on this in your presentation when you spoke about the zone of fear, but this attendee wanted to know, should we be letting children watch the news, or should we be protecting them from it, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, I know any of the difficult questions I'm passing on to Colman, but I know Colman's going to deal with this. In my view, you can't protect them completely from news. If you try to do that, they'll pick up the news from the wrong place, and you won't have any clue what they know or don't know. But on the other hand, you can, at some level, control it as best you can. So I think I would say it's important that they are able to get news that's accurate as best you can get it for them, and that you're controlling and brokering and explaining the information rather than them picking it up from elsewhere. But I think wall to wall, which is, you know, you stick the TV on in your house in the morning and it's running away there in the background, then there's nothing but wall to wall COVID all day long. That's what's happening. So you don't want that to happen. You also don't want them picking up information from the internet or from friends. You want an objective form of information coming in that you know what it is and you can explain it. So I would say it's about building a structure around that, and also around making sure we're in touch with our own reactions to this. It's really interesting how parents sometimes forget that. They start off with it, but it's very hard when we're afraid, when it's striking fear in our heart, to be able to help our children deal with that. So we have to be able to be aware of that and learn to deal with that first and foremost, and then be able to work with our children around it. And that's a real challenge at the moment.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul. We really appreciate you taking the time to do your presentation and answer our questions. Just to remind people, the Q&A tab is on the right hand side of your screen. If you have any questions for Colman's presentation coming up, during his presentation, you can just type in your question in the box, and that will come to us and we'll direct them to Colman. So, as I said, up next is Dr. Colman Noctor.
Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about negotiating anxiety in a post-COVID world, and I think we're all kind of struggling with this, and I think there's a degree of firefighting that everyone is trying to manage at the moment. And unless any of us are 107 years old and have been through the Spanish flu, this is the first time we're all encountering this kind of worldwide global pandemic. And a lot of parents are interested, fearful, and have lots of questions about the impact of this on children. And hopefully I'm going to be able to talk to that a little bit as we go this morning. So basically, who am I? Well, I'm a registered advanced nurse practitioner here in St. Patrick's Hospital and do some work as an assistant professor in TCD. I'm a child and adolescent psychotherapist, but more importantly, I'm a parent of 3 and a struggling COVID parent. And again, the difficulties of COVID, the idea behind it is that nobody's immune to this. It's affected absolutely everybody in every social class, in every circumstance. And so this pervasiveness has caused us to, I suppose, have a lot of queries, but also a lot of worries. And it's quite a change from my usual presentation. If anyone has heard me speak before, I've spoken a lot about how previously we were a time-poor society and we didn't have enough time to get to know ourselves. But however, the last 17 weeks or so has changed all that. We've much more time on our hands than perhaps we ever had before. And I think there's a learning opportunity in it. I think if we can learn from the experience that we've had as we attempt to reboard post-COVID, we may be able to make some changes and alterations to our priorities or to our lives that might indeed help us. So we were already living through the greatest social experiment of our time. And again, I would have spoken a lot about the impact of technology on children's mental health, but the addition of COVID-19 has added another variable to the greatest emotional experiment of our time. And again, by definition, when you don't know the outcome of something, by definition, that is an experiment. And so the idea that the impact of COVID or where it's going to be in terms of our children's mental health, we don't know the outcomes of that, and it will be a thing that only time will tell us. But we do know a little bit about anxiety, and maybe that's where we need to think about it. So if we think about, yes, there's that physical pandemic, but there's the other pandemic, which is anxiety. And this, I think in terms of even pre-COVID, I probably would have never seen, in the 24 years that I'm working clinically with children, I've never seen more anxious children than I have in the last 2 to 3 years. And certainly more anxious parents as well. So what is this culture of anxiety? Where is it coming from? What is it about? And essentially, anxiety, we really kind of whittle it back down. It is the fear of the unknown. So if you are heading into an exam or a job interview or a driving test, and you don't know the outcome of it, the unknown will create the anxiety. And COVID-19 is the biggest collective unknown we have ever experienced. So we didn't know anything about timelines. We didn't know when things were going to end. We were awaiting vaccines and second surges. All these unknowns create an uncertainty and an anxiety in all of us. And when anxiety is necessary, we all need to experience a surmountable degree of stress, and that's normative. That gets us up in the morning, it gets us prepared for things, and a degree of anxiety, say for example, about this presentation, might have made me go over my slides before I'm doing this, and it gives me a prep, and so it's within scale. But there is a point where anxiety becomes too much and its stress becomes panic. And it's really important for us to kind of have an idea of where that gauge is. And oftentimes we only realize that once we've passed it. And again, it's when you start to stress and panic and it starts to impede on your functioning, then we know that anxiety is no longer something that is productive, but it's actually maladaptive, and it's hindering our performance. So what are the effects of our resilience in anxious situations? What do we tend to do when we're anxious? Well, traditionally, anxiety creates, or people who tend to have a temperament towards anxiety, tend to overestimate the challenge and underestimate your own ability. So you're seeing all the kind of challenges ahead and seeing them as massive and overestimating that, but also underestimating your own confidence and your own self-worth and self-belief to be able to manage it. We sometimes end up concentrating on uncontrollable variables. So we get distressed about people who are having house parties or Texans who are coming in from other countries, or, these are things we can't personally control. So we can, if we think about the uncontrollable variables, we tend to get more anxious. Otherwise, we tend to over-control certain aspects of our lives, and that might have been where we saw the surge of people going out buying toilet roll at the start of this pandemic. So it was over-controlling by trying to secure some degree of security by saying we have enough toilet roll, we'll be okay. But again, that's a short-term kind of gratification of anxiety, and the major issues still persist. Relatively few past experiences of surmountable stress. So if we haven't had experience of stress before, we may find this particularly difficult. If we have a poor appreciation of your priorities, and if you tend to perhaps sweat the small stuff, then your anxiety is going to be worse in a situation like this. Low self-belief, of course, is really important. We really need to have a belief in our own abilities to cope and manage. and a tendency for all or nothing thinking. And again, that's where it's all a disaster or it's all going to be fine. Usually the truth is somewhere in the middle, and we need to kind of manage that a little bit better. But let's not pretend that COVID anxiety brought with it a difficulty or a threat of mental health problems in Ireland in children. They were there before COVID. And an interesting survey by My World Survey, My World 2 survey published late last year, revealed, and as Paul mentioned in his previous talk, 1 in 4 children will suffer from anxiety and depression in Ireland. 1 in 4, it's 25% of children. And we often hear about the millennial narrative about children can't cope. But we have to ask ourselves, why is this happening? What are the origins of this resilience crisis? And what does it look like now, mid-COVID-19? Well, essentially, prior to COVID, the main culprits for anxiety and resilience were thought to be overparenting and technology. So the idea that technology was a variable that was new, and so it must be making children less resilient or having an impact there. And parents who were helicoptering their children and not allowing them to experience any adversity were almost compromising their psychological immunity and creating a lack of resilience in that way. However, the COVID variable is pretty self-explanatory, and the reason why we're anxious around COVID is because, well, in reality, there's a virus spreading across the globe, taking lives, and this is a clear and present and real threat. So this isn't an irrational anxiety, it's a real one. Society, again, has been encouraged to relate to each other differently. We are told the need to stay away from each other, and we are told that we are a danger to others and others are a danger to us. And I understand the reason behind that messaging. It's a very important messaging in order to control the spread of the pandemic. However, there's been some, and most of our messaging I think has been helpful, but there's been 3 rather unhelpful COVID-19 messages, and there's 3 aspects of the COVID message that I would struggle with. They are the new normal, social distancing, and working from home. And I'll explain to you why I believe those to be the problem. This is not the new normal. This is the new abnormal. And again, in terms of thinking about children and the psychological impact of safety-informed pandemic, it's not normal. It's not normal to need to keep a social distance in a time of anxiety when we seek social proximity. It's not normal to be without the reassurance of touch. It's not normal to have the freedom of movement limited. And, you know, in terms of even when we were in lockdown and we had the 2K limits and the 5K limits, people were getting anxious about that, and you wondered why that was. Well, it removes your freedom of movement. So if you and I are sitting in a room and we're just talking and I just get up and lock the door and sit back down, nothing has changed in our conversation, but you may well feel more anxious because your freedom of movement has now been restricted. When we limit our non-verbal communication to just our eyes, and I just think that image of that child there on the right-hand side in the mask, that is not normal, and we can't normalize this. And the other thing is we are encouraged to behave like we are toxic. And that message that we had at the early stage, to act as if you have the coronavirus, and I guess I understand in that way how that may have encouraged us to behave differently. But what was the psychological impact and emotional impact of that, especially to children? Well, children have very few pre-COVID coping strategies. So the younger the child, the more this is going to be their template for life and relationships. This is what they're learning for the first time. These social nuances of communications in the abnormal world are what they will pick up as normative. They are motivated to comply with recommendations by fear. So fear is a very effective motivation. If you don't wash your hands, if you don't cover your mouth when you cough, bad things will happen. It makes us do it, but it doesn't help us to feel any less anxious about it. They are seen as vectors, and lots of children are describing high levels of anxieties, even when they're allowed to return to shops and things now, because they have had experiences of being glared at or felt that they're, vectors of viruses, and they would prefer to avoid that level of stress. But it's having an impact on the lens with which they see the world, but also that's having an impact on the lens with which they see themselves. And by that, I mean, we all create an internal working model of ourselves. So we see ourselves through the eyes of the other. If people like us and they react positively to things that we do more of it. If people act negatively to us or dismiss us, we tend to do less of it. So we see ourselves through the eyes of the other. And if the eyes of the other are seeing us as vectors or seeing us as spreaders or whatever the case may be, that impacts on our own idea of ourselves and our own self-esteem and self-worth and self-belief. The fearful thing about it is the true impact of COVID-19 will not be obvious until we return to reboard. And I'm encouraged to hear the plans about returning to school and the various pods and things that are being discussed, and at least it gives us some idea of a known. But when in child and adolescent mental health services, we would see the peaks in referrals not June, July, and August. We see them September, October. We don't see them over Christmas week. We see them in January, and we don't see them in kind of post-exam time. We see them in May, and those 3 peaks are not when the summer holidays or Christmas holidays are happening. It's when they're ending. So it's the return to the normal that creates the anxiety. It's the return, and children have had lots of time with parents that they may not have had before. They're not in creches, they're not in childcare, and they have probably adapted very kind of well to the new normal. But the idea is, or the new abnormal, it's going to have to revert back. The second part is that it's impacted on parents' experience of anxiety, and our anxiety as parents is affected by our expectations. And I always give this slide in every presentation I do because I think it's really crucial. And if you wanted to just take one piece from this this presentation, this is it. So how to be a parent in 2020? Well, it's very simply just make sure your child's academic, social, psychological, spiritual, physical, and nutritional needs are met. Being careful not to overstimulate, understimulate, helicopter, or neglect them. In a screen-free, processed food-free, negative energy-free, body-positive, socially conscious, egalitarian, yet authoritative environment that nurtures but fosters independence, is gentle but not over-permissive, in a 2-story home, preferably in a cul-de-sac, with a back garden and 1.5 children spaced evenly apart, and not forgetting the coconut oil. So I hope you understand that that's a joke, and it depends on how far down that list I got before you realized it was a joke that you may indicate your level of self-parenting pressure. This is, we all want all these things. They're all very idealistic, but they're not all possible. And especially in a time where COVID is happening and where our parenting is being compromised considerably, we need to actually, rather than making it more complicated, we maybe need to go back and make it less complicated. Comparing that to being a parent in literally every other generation prior to now, keep them safe and feed them sometimes. And again, that's said a little bit in tongue in cheek, but what I'm saying is maybe it's not about adding new things into parenting, but getting back to older things and more traditional ways in which communication and approachability can be facilitated. It's also about managing our expectations. A very simple formula I have for happiness, and I don't necessarily agree with the concept of happiness. I think it's a very momentary thing, but even contentment. We look at expectation minus reality equals happiness. And from that point of view, largely the reasons why we feel disgruntled or discontent is not necessarily because our reality is that compromised, but that our expectations are too high. And throughout the COVID lockdown, we've had to manage our expectations. We've had to pare them right down simply because our access to things that would normally be really important to us were not available. And I'm hoping that the reduction in those expectations last post-COVID, that we now have a different level of priorities or value systems that we can gauge how well or badly we're doing as parenting. And the idea that I always talk about the parenting triangle. So you can have 2 of these 3 points in this triangle. You can have your sanity, a clean house, or happy children. So you basically can only pick 2. So it means that there has to be sacrifices. And this parenting triangle has now become a parenting cube or hexagon maybe, where now you have to be a full-time employee and a homeschooler and a teacher as well. And this has created considerable pressure on parents. And I think parents, although the homeschooling demand is maybe not there at the moment, we're still recovering from it. It was the idea that, this is the second part that I have the issue with, working from home. Remember, if you have, in the current situation, at home with children, you are not working from home, you are parenting from work. And that's an incredibly important system. If I'm thinking about working from home, I'm thinking my children are off in school or in childcare, I'm at home, I have my laptop out, my cup of coffee, my classical music going in the background, and I'm engaging in writing or meetings, whatever it is. It's not the same when I'm sitting in front of a computer trying to do a Microsoft Teams meeting or a session where my 7-year-old has just spilled Nutella all over the floor, my 9-year-old has a nosebleed, and my 5-year-old can't work the sky. So from the point of view of and it's even if they're not happening, the potential that they could happen. When you're doing these kind of virtual things, the potential intrusion creates a stress that you're doing. It's exactly the same as saying to you, bring your children into work and do your job from your office and mind your children at the same time. It is simply not the same as working from home. And I think the expectation that it might be is where we would feel that we're failing. And what's happening is, yes, it's liberating that technology has allowed us to think that we can work from anywhere, but it also means it's now the case that we can work from everywhere. And the more freedom comes with less boundaries. So the more we are given the freedom to work from home and remotely, perhaps the less boundaries we have. So we're more likely to send the email at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night because there's a kind of a sense of us being over available. And so it's not a cost neutral thing. There are stresses involved in that. The other thing is that multitasking is a digital myth. The idea that we can do 7 things to the same quality as if we were doing them one at a time is simply not true. And we need to, as parents and people, manage that. Yes, we're not computers. We can't keep 6 windows open at one time and work on all the things at the same time. Multitasking is a digital myth, and we have to be able to manage our expectations around doing that. And when you're parenting from home, you're left with many choices around, do I serve my employer, which I need to because I'm being paid, or do I tend to my children? So we're being left in these situations where, yes, we have to do this meeting, which is really important, but it means we're leaving our children in the sitting room in front of the TV for 2 hours, and we're feeling bad and guilty about not giving enough to our work or not giving enough to our parents. And so from the point of view, these stresses are creating more and more anxiety in us. And again, another myth is the idea that blending learning would happen or work for primary school children. Simply, I think or anyone who has homeschooled over the last number of months realizes that education is but a small part of school, because children learn to play. They learn through social nuances, through development expectations, through milestone formation and skill development, and they learn in groups from each other. Children are doers, they're not talkers. So I've had parents saying to me, would it help if my 6-year-old, FaceTimed his other 6-year-old friend? That generally doesn't work because children don't shoot the breeze. Their language is interactive, so they go and do things together. And so although the technology has been wonderful in many ways for us as adults to keep in touch with people, it hasn't had the same purpose for younger children. But what's the impact of socialization for children? It's largely unknown because we've never had such a collective, but we would have had examples of children who maybe have had chronic illness or whatever the case may be and would have been removed from their peer group for 6 or 8 months at a time. And we do know that what we see in those situations is a bit of developmental arrest, there's a bit of regression in children's development because they're not learning at the same pace as they would if they were in groups. They do develop a social anxiety and they engage in avoidance behaviours when it's time to regain or reboard. And they have developed an over-dependence on adults. So they're so used to adult company that they would rely a little bit heavier on that. The COVID-19 effect is that, and I would say to you as a parent, don't feel bad because everyone has this experience. Your bedtimes are gone, your screen time limits are gone, your dietary and exercise levels are gone, your rules of interaction have changed, and there's been unexplained absences of primary figures like teachers, grandparents, etc. Everyone no matter what their WhatsApp group says, everyone is struggling with this. This is a real challenge, and because our own structures have suffered as a result of COVID and the lockdown and everything else, our children's structures have suffered as well. And the worry for many people is the screen time issue. And I would say to you, technology is not good or bad, it's actually both. And so rather than getting obsessed about the screen time issue, think about it as the nature of what they're using on the screen. So it's not good or bad technology, it's good or bad usage. So through COVID-19, we've seen a really mature use of technology. We're using technology to work remotely, to use blended learning approaches, to video call older relatives who are cocooning, and for provision of goods and services. So most of us were on Amazon every second day and had those deliveries coming all the time, and our Tesco was done through online shopping, etc. So the technology, we're using it on our terms rather than using it. And what I'd say to you as a parent is the screen time debate is really, you need to throw that into question. It's less about the time spent and more about the time well spent. So for example, if Paul spends an hour on line and he's on YouTube learning a song on a guitar, that's a very good use of his time. He's learning a skill and he's developing something. Whereas I would spend an hour on Instagram going through other people's profiles and feeling utterly miserable about myself. And so I come away feeling dreadful. The both of us have just spent an hour, and the screen time will only measure an hour. So it's rather than getting involved in kind of the dashboard being the time spent, try and engage your children in time well spent. And so that what they're doing on technology isn't just watching other people playing games or doing sort of lizard brain activities, but they may be engaging in other things which may be a little bit more useful to them. The other thing is we maybe have learned that it's less about gratification and more about fulfillment. And I think the technology narrative is a different issue here, because technology is all about gratification. Tap this, get that. Whereas perhaps over the lockdown period, we've had an appreciation of fulfillment. And to explain the difference, if I was to go to the gym today for 9 hours, I wouldn't look any different after the 9 hours as I would before. Whereas if I went to the gym 20 minutes 3 times a week for 6 months, I would see a change. And so that's a fulfilling and not a gratification issue. So sometimes the more labor we have to put into something, the more fulfilling the experience is. And perhaps, I guess, the technology narrative makes us kind of focus much more on gratification than fulfillment. And I think our children's resilience is probably compromised by that belief. COVID has also taught us that it's not just about the task, it's about the process. So if technology is just about getting something done, we miss out on the opportunities for conversation and the water cooler moments. So if we're in a place of work and we have an opportunity someone's late for a meeting or something, that might be where a conversation happens about, so come here, how are you doing? I heard your mom was sick, how's she doing? Oh, she's grand, thanks very much. And that's where relationships are developed. Whereas technology is so neatly packaged around giving us what we need rather than giving us what we want rather than what we need, it may compromise our ability to have that collegiality. And again, I'd go back to the homeschooling issue of how difficult it was to just homeschool when the whole focus of the day was just the academic work without the play and the PE and the collective experience of being together. What compromises our resilience is this always-on culture where it's more than we can handle. It's an anti-reflection culture. We disable our sense of self. And I do believe that the mindlessness of the culture that we were maybe living in pre-COVID was making our minds full, which made us engage in mindfulness, if that makes sense, and impacting on our sense of identity. And because things are moving so fast, we forget to get to know ourselves. And resilience isn't about toughness. It's not about having a tough life. It's not about having traumas or adversity. It's about a relationship with yourself that contains self-belief and accuracy. And one of the things I hope throughout the COVID experience is that we've had time to get to know ourselves. But the opportunity now is, as we reboard, can we take back some agency and control over our own choices? Can we re-look at things? Like, has COVID impacted on us in the way that, has it put us a pause where we've kind of been consumed with complete uncertainty? Or has it given us too much time alone where we've lost our social appetite? Or have we had too much time and we've now engaged in rumination? Or has it given us time to stop, given us an opportunity to get to know ourselves, and given us an opportunity to reflect, reprioritize, and reorganize? And I'm guessing for most of us, it's been all 6 of those things, and we've oscillated between kind of having plans and taking it as a reflective opportunity and then slipping into rumination. So how can we use the learnings of COVID to reboard the merry-go-round differently? And again, I think we need to rethink things like hectic scheduling, sweating the small stuff, taking relationships for granted, reprioritizing family time, and re-emphasizing on experiences and not things. And again, in terms of research that we would have done a couple of years ago, children generally remember experiences and kind of building forts in the sitting room with the cushions or baking together more than they remember things. And I think from the point of view of us having to be creative as parents to find things to do and have experiences without the distraction of cinemas and various activities or extracurricular stuff, has by accidental we've become creative in how we've probably able to manage it. So for now, we just need to engage in survival and the reflective mode. This is not a time for expectations or reevaluation. It's not about pressure. It's about allowing things to slip, because that's utterly understandable, and not comparing yourself to other WhatsApp group and their tales of how they've done 2 hours of Latin and 6 nature hikes in the morning. That creating that pressure is not going to make us feel any better about ourselves and not be able to contain our ability to parent our children. If I was to give you one tip, I would say this is it. It's the 4 to 7 rule. And very simply, when we run into problems, we tend to be on the extreme side of things. And the very simplistic thing about mental well-being being about moderation and equilibrium is really, really true. So if you're thinking about a scale of 1 to 10 on everything that you do, if you're in 1, 2, 3 or 8, 9, 10, you need to pull it back to 4 to 7. So whether that's your relationship or engagement with technology, whether it's your anxiety levels, whether it's your exposure to COVID-19 stuff, whether it's your parenting, whether it's your expectations, if you're in the 1, 2, 3, 8, 9, 10, pull it back to 4 to 7, because in the 4 to 7 is where you're safest. That's where we're trying to do, and that's that kind of achieving that equilibrium all the time and keeping kind of tabs on that and being able to manage our own dial pinging too much in the left and right is going to be the most important thing in terms of stabilizing the experience. And the last thing I'm going to tell you is, and I know you heard me speak before, you're well familiar with this story. And I think it's a useful way in which we can kind of formulate an idea or a metaphor around our priorities and what's important. So a philosophy lecturer comes into a class and he shows them a jar and he fills it full of rocks. And he says to the class, "Is it full?" And they said, "Yes." And then he gets some pebbles and he sprinkles them in between the rocks and he says, "Now is it full?" And they said, "Yes." And then he gets some sand and sprinkles it between the rocks and the pebbles. He said, "Now is it full?" And they said, "Yes." And he said that represents a meaningful and fulfilled life. The rocks are the really important things, like your friendships, your intimate relationships, and your family and your health. These pebbles are the semi-important things, like your work ethic or what grades you work at or your job or whatever. And the sand is the cosmetic rubbish, like the likes and the followers and the cosmetic things that are really not that important. In order to feel fulfilled, we must put the rocks in first, then the pebbles, and then the sand. And my worry before was pre-COVID, we were being sold sand all the time and we were filling our lives with sand, and it was making us feel a kind of an emptiness or sense of feeling that we were sweating the small stuff. Maybe COVID has allowed us, this forced pause has allowed us to empty out the jar, and it's now up to us to refill it. And I think it's really important that we choose wisely and use the opportunity to refill the jar by putting our rocks in first, then our pebbles, and then our sand. But to any parents who've been through the COVID situation, there's one message I wanted to leave you with. And I want to say, so your children survived on snacks today. They're still safe, they're still loved. So your children had no homeschooling today. They're still safe, they're still loved. So your children had way too much tablet time today. They're still safe and they're still loved. So your children had no routine at the minute. They're staying up late and sleeping in the morning. They're still safe and they're still loved. And so your house is a mess and you're overwhelmed, but you're still safe and you're still loved. So maybe you're not failing at anything, but instead you're surviving everything. Remember, someday, parents, we will feel on top of the world, and the others, we will feel the world is on top of us. And it's about negotiating and surviving the oscillation of the two, and just managing our expectations. And I hope that's been helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Colman, and it's a lovely take-home message to end your presentation on. Really lovely. We've had a few questions in, so I've pulled out 4 because I'm really conscious of time. So I'll go ahead and just jump straight into them, if that's okay. Yeah. So question 1 is, it's a 2-part question, if that's okay. Is there any evidence to suggest ADHD medication can make anxiety worse? And are there any strategies for helping a child with ADHD cope with anxiety?
Yeah, well, I suppose any medication that involves a kind of a psychotropic medication has many different side effects. So sometimes people would describe a kind of an anxiety. They might describe a kind of a loss of the personality, or the person seems to feel like they're different, or they've lost their glint. So side effects from all medications are worth paying attention to. And yes, there's a possibility that some medications may cause you to be anxious where previously you wouldn't be. And with any medication, you're looking at what is the risk of treatment versus the risk of not treatment. So if you're trialing a medication and it is improving your child's behavior, their attention, their ability to concentrate, then you have to weigh up how useful that is. And so each individual person will have a kind of an assessment on that. In terms of the anxiety involved in having ADHD, regardless of the medication issue, is an issue, because the issue with ADHD is that people misunderstand your difficulties as behavior. And so you get kind of labeled as a bold child or a naughty child or a lazy child. And that has huge impacts on your self-esteem growing forward. And so the major prognostic, the best prognostic indicator for ADHD is parental understanding of the condition. So if you can separate that's ADHD, that's behavior, and being able to manage your child as best they can, that's the best way in which you can move forward with it. So gaining an understanding of it. In terms of the medication, if it's working and it's improving your child's well-being, and the risk of not treating them may be worse in terms of a self-esteem point of view. So you've got to weigh up all these things. It's a very complex question to try and answer in a couple of sentences. But yes, there's a possibility it may be causing anxiety, but there's also the possibility that ADHD may be causing the anxiety. So it may be different to decipher which is which.
Thanks, Colman. Our second question is from a parent wondering how you feel about a 12-year-old taking medication to control their anxiety. And just to give a little bit of context, he's also getting therapy, but it's not helping his anxiety in situations where his parents are not present. He's starting secondary school in September, so it's very worrying for his parents.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the issues we have is that we think about mental health as a very unitary concept. Mental health is really complex. And so if you imagine it like almost like a piece of cake, right? So the top layer is biology, the middle layer is psychology, and the bottom layer is social. So there's three of those components in everything. So our biology is about, again, our brain chemistry, but also about our sleep, our appetite, our concentration, etc. And so from the point of view of you have to get the biology right, then the psychology is about how we think about things, the lens with which we see the world, how negative or positive, or our temperament towards managing anxiety. And then obviously the social is the circumstances or the systems with which we exist in. So mental health treatment involves the biology, the psychology, and the social. So there's an education piece needed, there's a psychological piece needed, and maybe a biological piece needed. So unless all of those things are being managed, it's going to be very difficult for any child to cope. We may get the biology right, but the social bit might be wrong. We might get the psychology right, but the biology is wrong. And so it's important to not see mental health as you just need to take the medicine and you're better, or you go talking to someone or you're better, or you go to family therapy and better. Sometimes you may need changes in all three. And again, it's difficult to consider the complexity of mental health and mental illnesses and mental health difficulties, but they are complex problems, and they're not things. And I would say to any parent, managing your expectations about treating a child with anxiety, yes, of course it will get better. Yes, of course there's ways to get around this, but these are oftentimes issues that are not resolved in a week. They take quite a lot of time, and a lot of the systems around the child involved, albeit teachers, family, and maybe even an individual support for them as well.
Thanks, Colman. Our next parent would like to know, what can I do to help my teenager during panic attacks, or how do we help find the triggers?
Yeah, panic attacks, they may have triggers, they may not. I mean, the panic attack is essentially an adrenaline release in your brain that causes you to create a kind of a physiological anxiety. So you'll oftentimes feel your heart beating, you'll feel sweating, you'll feel that you may be having a heart attack almost. But what makes it worse is the cognitions that you apply to it. So if you think, oh my God, I'm going to have a heart attack, oh my God, that creates more adrenaline to be released into the system, creating more of a sense of panic. So the way in which you manage panic attack is by very simply saying, I know what this is. So I don't add fuel to the fire. I'm not going to add the cognitions. I'm not going to add the worries to this. I'm just going to breathe through it and allow the adrenaline work through the system and work out. And then you can resolve it quite quickly. Whereas if you add fuel to the fire with the cognitions and the worries and the emotions, then you're creating more and more of the adrenaline release, therefore causing more and more of the biology. So for me, the key to understanding panic attacks is understanding what they are. And again, that old adage, this too will pass, I know what this is the most effective way in terms of shortening the frequency and severity of them.
Thank you. And our last question is, any ideas on how to reassure my 9-year-old about debt?
I wouldn't get too stressed about this, because sometimes this is a kind of a rite of passage for children. Children of kind of ages between 7 and 10 will oftentimes worry about death, and it's an issue around permanency. So they're kind of getting to grips with a sense of absence and presence, and death being the ultimate absence. So many children will go through periods of worrying about this, which with a little bit of reassurance and safety, it will pass. Obviously, depending on the length of time, the frequency and the acuity of it. What you're trying to do is encourage the child, not so much about death, but about their life, that there's a containment to them, that nothing is going to change, that things are safe, that things are okay, and kind of that no matter what it is, you've got this. And it's really important as the adult in the room to kind of remove the worry from children and say, no matter what you're going through, the adults in the room will manage this for you. It's not about promising that things won't be difficult, but if they are difficult, you've got this.
Thank you so much, Colman, and thank you to Paul as well for taking the time today to come on and give our parents some helpful advice. It's really appreciated. Just to mention to our attendees, I'll also be sending on the link to the recording of this webinar as well, so that you'll get that in the next few days if you want to look at anything, look back on anything on the recording. And we've also, if it's not in there already, we're going to add a feedback survey link just into the Q&A box on the right hand side. If you wouldn't mind just taking a couple of minutes, there's 5 really quick questions, but your feedback is really appreciated. So if you could just take the couple of minutes to fill that in, that'd be brilliant. And in general, if you want any further information on resources or articles, upcoming webinars, you can contact myself and Walk in My Shoes on 01249 3632, or you can visit the website walkinmyshoes.ie. But if any parents would like any further support and information on any of the topics covered today, you can contact our support and information line on 01249 3333. And thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and we hope you took some good advice from both presentations. And we hope everyone has a lovely day. So thank you and take care.